Welcome to Buzzing Media Trending Talks, where we dig into the biggest courtroom battles, trending stories, and cultural turning points. If it's buzzing, we're breaking it down. You've likely seen the headlines, heard the chatter, maybe felt a real sense of intrigue around one of the most talked about legal battles in, well, recent memory, the federal trial of Sean Combs.
Yeah.
It's a case that has absolutely captivated public attention, hasn't it? Stirring up so much debate and really shining a harsh spotlight on that whole intersection of celebrity, power, and some deeply serious allegations.
It really has.
Our mission today is to conduct a deep dive, really get into the core of this complex story. We're going to take a closer look at what actually unfolded in the courtroom during those pivotal closing arguments. We'll hear how both sides presented their cases and try to understand the dramatic backdrop of public reactions surrounding it all. We'll be drawing directly from detailed accounts of the proceedings, offering you a concise but hopefully comprehensive understanding.
Yeah, and hopefully with enough detail for those aha moments. What's truly fascinating here, I think, is how the legal arguments in this trial intertwine so deeply with, well, personal narratives and the broader public perception.
Right.
This isn't just a legal case happening in a vacuum, contained within the four walls of a courtroom. It's undeniably become a cultural moment. It forces us, really, to confront and maybe reconsider some fundamental questions, things like accountability, the very nuanced nature of consent, and the essence of truth itself when it's presented under such intense scrutiny.
Yeah.
Especially when you have these high-profile figures involved.
Absolutely.
So yeah, we'll explore the claims, the counterclaims, and the male judge's crucial role in, well, guiding the jury through what has truly been a labyrinth of information. It's a lot to unpack. Before we delve in, it's important we acknowledge the sensitive nature of the allegations we'll be discussing. This deep dive is based entirely on publicly available information from the courtroom proceedings. It's intended for informational and educational discussion only. The following segment may reference difficult allegations, and it is absolutely crucial to remember that all individuals are presumed innocent unless proven guilty in a court of law. Listener discretion is advised. We are impartially reporting on the content provided in the sources, not endorsing any specific viewpoints contained within that original material.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's begin then with the prosecution's closing arguments. They really set a very emotional and stark tone right from the outset, didn't they?
They did.
The prosecutor, Ms. Slavic, she presented Sean Combs not just as an individual facing charges, but as the alleged leader of what she described very specifically as a criminal enterprise.
Right, that phrase itself is powerful.
It is. That term alone immediately framed the case for the jury, suggesting it wasn't just about isolated incidents, but part of a much larger organized pattern of alleged misconduct. Using the word enterprise, it just suggests a deliberate, structured operation, doesn't it? Rather than, spontaneous or unrelated acts, it really raised the stakes considerably.
Indeed, yeah. Ms. Slavic's central claim was exactly that. This alleged enterprise was, in her words, built on control, coercion, and abuse. They detailed a truly disturbing pattern, arguing that Combs allegedly used illegal substances, threats, money, and manipulation to force multiple women, and they specifically named Cassie Ventura, Jane Doe, Mia, and Capricorn Clark into grueling sexual acts and labor.
Grueling acts and labor. Wow.
Yeah, and often they claimed this was done under the guise of what looked like consensual relationships or even, legitimate employment opportunities.
So hiding in plain sight, almost.
That was the argument. The prosecution painted this very calculated, systematic picture. They asserted that even events referred to as freak-offs were characterized as being filled with illegal substances, violent assaults, threats to release intercourse tapes, and relentless psychological control.
That phrase, relentless psychological control, that really stands out.
It does. It's critical because it implies this deep, continuous manipulation at play, something designed to, well, strip away an individual's ability to genuinely consent. It wasn't just about one moment of coercion, but an ongoing state, according to the prosecution.
And the prosecution really seemed to lean heavily into this idea that even if consent appeared to be given in some situations, it was actually an illusion.
Exactly.
Ms. Slavic argued that even when some women seemed to consent, that consent was, quote, the result of fear, grooming, or trauma bonding. Now, that term, trauma bonding, that's a particularly complex legal and psychological argument. For our listeners, what exactly does trauma bonding imply psychologically, and how did the prosecution use that concept to challenge the whole idea of consent here?
That's a really crucial point to understand. Trauma bonding, it refers to this strong emotional attachment that can develop between an abused person and their abuser. It's often reinforced by cycles of abuse, followed by periods of maybe intermittent kindness or positive reinforcement.
Right, that up and down cycle.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this creates a powerful, often subconscious bond that can make it incredibly difficult for a victim to leave the relationship or to report the abuse, or even sometimes to perceive their own lack of free will. So when the prosecution uses this term, they're essentially arguing that even if an act looked consensual on the surface, the underlying dynamic of fear, manipulation, and this profound emotional bond, it basically negated genuine voluntariness.
I see.
It's a very nuanced argument. It pushes beyond just a simple yes or no and really delves into the psychological complexities of power imbalances within these kinds of relationships.
And to secure a RIOA conviction, that's the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the law requires proof that the defendant committed, at least 2 predicate acts of racketeering activity within a 10-year period.
That's the legal standard, yes.
And the prosecution asserted that the jury had been shown dozens of such acts, far more than the minimum requirement. Now, for listeners who might know RICO more from, say, traditional organized crime cases, like mafia cases, what makes applying it here, specifically with allegations tied to personal relationships and this alleged coercive behavior, such a bold or maybe even contentious legal strategy?
Oh, that's a crucial question. It really highlights the complexity here. RICO is, well, it's known for being robust, but also notoriously complex to actually prove.
Right.
Its history, as you said, is really in dismantling mafia structures, large criminal organizations. So applying it here means the prosecution wasn't just alleging individual assaults or isolated instances of coercion. No, they were arguing for a systematic pattern of behavior. And not just that, but that this pattern was integrated into a broader ongoing criminal organization, even if that organization also had legitimate fronts, like music and business ventures.
So the legitimate parts don't cancel out the alleged illegitimate parts.
According to RICO law, no. The challenge, though, lies in convincing a jury that these freak-offs, or these alleged coercive relationships, weren't just private, maybe unconventional matters, but were actually systemic racketeering activity designed to benefit an illicit enterprise. It's a very high bar to clear. It requires the jury to connect what might seem like personal interactions to a much broader criminal conspiracy. And crucially, the prosecution didn't just point the finger at Combs himself.
No, they brought others in.
Exactly. Ms. Slavic implicated Combs' inner circle, his assistants, his bodyguards, his staff, alleging they were not just bystanders, but actively enabled his alleged behavior. Things like booking travel, supplying illegal substances, helping cover things up.
So suggesting a widespread conspiracy.
That was the clear implication, yes, that multiple individuals were allegedly involved in either facilitating or concealing the activities of this alleged enterprise.
So, with such incredibly grave allegations, the prosecution must have needed to bring some compelling, tangible evidence, right? Beyond just the witness testimony. What sort of specific proof did they actually present to the jury?
Well, they definitely adopted a multifaceted approach. They didn't just rely on testimony. The courtroom was presented with photos, they read text messages out loud, and they played recordings that the prosecution claimed directly supported these allegations.
Okay.
The goal seemed to be providing a comprehensive and, ideally for them, undeniable picture for the jury, using direct communications, visual proof, things that could corroborate what the witnesses were saying on the stand.
Right, backing it up.
Exactly. For instance, text messages might show directives or planning related to the alleged activities, while recordings could potentially capture conversations or events central to the claims.
And what's also striking, according to the source material, is Combs' own reaction in the courtroom during this part of the prosecution's closing.
Yes, that was noted.
While he'd apparently maintained composure through much of the trial, he appeared visibly nervous during the prosecution's closing, reportedly rubbing his hands and shifting in his seat from side to side as the jury listened intently. In a high-stakes courtroom like that, how much do those seemingly small nonverbal cues really tell us? Or perhaps more importantly, how much might they potentially influence a jury, even subconsciously?
That's a truly fascinating detail, isn't it? And it's something legal analysts always watch. Now, technically, a jury is strictly instructed to base their decision only on the evidence presented and the law, not on the defendant's demeanor.
Right, that's the rule.
That's the rule. But of course, jurors are human. These nonverbal cues are still observed. They often reflect the immense pressure and the sheer emotional weight of the moment. For someone who has maintained composure throughout, a sudden shift like that, Well, it could be interpreted in various ways. Maybe it's a reaction to the specific graphic nature of the allegations being recounted right then.
Hmm.
Or perhaps it's the realization of the stark gravity of the prosecution's final argument. It certainly humanizes the defendant, regardless of guilt or innocence, and just reminds everyone in that room of the intense personal stakes involved for him.
Absolutely. Ultimately, the prosecution's message was just unequivocal, wasn't it? And
Wow.
clearly designed to leave a lasting, heavy impression on the jury before the defense even got its turn.
Oh, absolutely.
They concluded by stating, Combs' empire wasn't just about music, it was built on silence, shame, and systemic abuse. That framing, it really set a heavy tone. It positioned the entire case as this monumental quest for justice against a pervasive system of alleged exploitation.
Yeah, they were trying to impress upon the jury that this was about much more than just individual acts.
Right. Painting a picture of an empire built not just on, creative talent and business success, but on these dark, hidden foundations, a very powerful closing image. Okay, so after the prosecution laid out that incredibly stark picture, arguing for this carefully constructed criminal enterprise, the defense then faced the formidable task of, well, tearing that entire image down.
A huge task.
Shifting gears dramatically, the lead attorney, Marc Agnifilo, presented a profoundly different narrative. He framed the allegations not as a criminal enterprise at all, but often as twisted interpretations of personal relationships. He even referred to them at one point as a modern love story.
Which is quite a contrast.
A massive contrast. It immediately aimed to humanize the complex dynamics involved and move completely away from the prosecution's stark criminal framing. How does a defense attorney even attempt to resculpt the narrative so profoundly, moving it from a federal criminal indictment to something as intimate, or at least framed as intimate, as a modern love story?
Well, it's an incredibly challenging pivot, right? It requires a very deliberate, carefully crafted strategy. Agnifilo's approach seemed to focus on a few key areas, emphasizing the civil settlements that had already happened, highlighting personal history between the individuals involved, and portraying a lifestyle that, while perhaps unconventional, maybe even morally questionable to some people, was, in his view, fundamentally consensual and private, not criminal racketeering.
Right. Keep it out of the criminal realm.
Exactly. He directly challenged the prosecution's framing by describing their case as, and this is a quote, a trial set forth out of the prosecutor's mouth versus a trial set forth by text messages.
Implying the words didn't match the actual evidence.
Precisely. He argued that the actual evidence, especially the communications like texts, pointed more towards personal use of illegal substances and maybe a swinger's lifestyle, but not a coordinated racketeering operation. He famously stated, "The prosecutors have charged one of the most serious statutes on the book. They call threesomes and illegal substances ICO."
Wow, that's a blunt statement.
It was a very bold move. It attempts to minimize the severity of the charges by suggesting the prosecution was massively overreaching, mischaracterizing a private, if perhaps unconventional life as a major federal crime. It's all about reframing the very nature of the alleged acts.
And on that really sensitive issue of domestic violence, the defense took a surprising tactic, didn't they? They essentially owned that it occurred, but then immediately stressed it was not charged in this specific ICO case.
Yes, that was notable.
Agnifilo even claimed that if it had been charged separately, Combs would have pleaded guilty. What's the strategy behind admitting something like that, but then trying to cordon it off from the main charges?
It's a calculated risk, I think. The strategy seems to be acknowledge the undeniable, perhaps regain some credibility by not fighting every single negative assertion, but then immediately pivot. Separate that difficult, perhaps publicly known aspect of the relationship from the core RAC and SA trafficking charges the jury is there to decide on.
Right. That's bad, but it's not this.
Essentially, yes. Arguing it was a different matter entirely, and not what this specific trial was about. He even highlighted Cassie Ventura's own Instagram post where she stated domestic violence is the issue,
Yeah.
suggesting she herself didn't describe it as SA trafficking at that time. He was trying to use her own words, in a sense, to undermine the prosecution's broader narrative and focus.
Interesting. And then there was the money argument.
Oh, yes. A core defense argument was that the entire case was ultimately about money. They zeroed in on Cassie Ventura's reported $30 million civil settlement.
$30 million.
Agnifilo asserted, quite directly, that if Combs doesn't have it, no civil lawsuit, no criminal case.
Implying it's all about the deep pockets.
That's the clear implication, suggesting a strong financial motivation behind the allegations, arguing that the pursuit of legal action was entirely contingent on Combs' wealth rather than being a pure pursuit of justice for alleged wrongs. He dramatically described the crime scene as your private intercourse life and noted pointedly that no one called 911, they called civil plaintiffs' lawyers.
That's a powerful line.
It is. It seeks to characterize the whole legal process as essentially a civil dispute rooted in financial claims that was somehow being dressed up as a criminal case, driven by the potential for monetary gain, not genuine justice. It's a classic defense strategy, isn't it? If you can't fully refute the facts, you question the motive behind the accusations.
Right. Cast doubt on why we're even here. Now, beyond the specifics of the allegations themselves, Agnifilo also spent significant time trying to build up Sean Combs' character, didn't he?
He did, yeah. Portraying him as a real self-made black entrepreneur who built real businesses that are so outstanding that others create partnerships with them.
Directly countering the prosecution's criminal enterprise narrative.
Exactly. Emphasizing his legitimate, successful career, his philanthropic efforts. They even had a witness, Derek Ferguson, testify that working with Combs was like Harvard Business School, and that assistants were moved by him, that they grew through hard work under his guidance. The defense highlighted Combs' alleged commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion (DEI) from a young age, specifically mentioning age 24, contrasting this sharply with the prosecution calling his whole business operation racketeering.
So painting this picture of a visionary businessman, a titan of industry almost.
Precisely. Trying to completely reframe his public image and the nature of his empire, making it seem incompatible with the criminal mastermind narrative the prosecution was pushing.
The defense also seemed to really dramatize the circumstances around Combs' arrest, the raid.
Yes, they did. They described the property destruction during the raid by an SRT special response team and heavily emphasized that Combs' kids were there, mentioning 6 of his 7 children, including an infant.
That's a very strong emotional appeal.
Absolutely. Designed to evoke sympathy from the jury, portray the severe, maybe disproportionate traumatic impact of the raid on his innocent family. Agnifilo further portrayed Combs as a man who takes care of people, even pointing out that Jane Doe, one of the accusers, is in a house he's paying for, even after her allegations surfaced.
Trying to show a benevolent side.
That seems to be the goal. Another attempt to show a responsible, maybe even caring side to his character, even towards those testifying against him, aiming to sow doubt about the prosecution's narrative of a heartless abuser.
Okay, let's turn to the relationship dynamics, especially with Cassie Ventura. The defense really tried to present that differently.
Very differently. They framed their 11-year relationship as an intense relationship based on love, making a point to emphasize that the word love was mentioned over 800 times during the trial evidence, like text.
800 times?
Yeah. They suggested Cassie was smart, but also insanely jealous. There was even a claim she flat Jan, which seems like a coded or unclear reference in the source, but also that she now had $30 million and Combs was in jail, implying she had somehow won 100-0.
That's a pretty cynical take on it.
It is, suggesting she was maybe a calculating individual who ultimately came out ahead financially and personally. The defense also highlighted texts from the time of their breakup, describing them as making one cry, showing them being selfless with each other, trying to prove a deep, albeit clearly complicated, affection existed between them. Agnifilo argued that if racketeer and conspiracy had an opposite, it would be their relationship, trying to frame their bond as fundamentally antithetical to the criminal enterprise alleged by the prosecution. He even claimed they were their best selves when it came to Smeg, and that Cassie was a woman who loves Smeg and it's beautiful, she is unafraid, implying genuine enthusiastic participation in sexual activities, directly contrasting the prosecution's claims of coercion and abuse.
So a complete 180 from the prosecution's portrayal.
Absolutely complete.
The defense also took on some of the other specific allegations head on, right? Trying to dismantle them piece by piece. What about Mia?
Yes, regarding Mia, the defense argued she actually loved working for Mr. Combs, and that it was definitely not forced labor. They cited things like a supposedly bubbly, popping birthday video she was in, and even a scrapbook Mia allegedly made for Combs.
A scrapbook?
Yeah, apparently it included sentiments like, "Happy 45th birthday, Puff. I hope it stirs up nostalgic feelings how great you've become." This was clearly a direct attempt to undermine Mia's credibility on the stand, painting her as someone who was previously very happy and supportive, suggesting she later changed her narrative. They even suggested her testimony against him was just an act, arguing that if Combs had felt her conduct at the time was improper, he wouldn't have threatened to tell Cassie about it. the implication being that the behavior must have been consensual between them.
Okay. What about the illegal substance distribution claims?
On that, the defense maintained that any illegal substances found were strictly for personal use. They pointed to the case of Brendan Paul, whose own related charges were dismissed. They really challenged the idea that Combs used his broader enterprise to distribute illegal substances, even posing a rhetorical question like, was he supposed to grow his own Xanax?
Trying to make the prosecution's argument sound absurd.
Exactly, suggesting it was a ridiculous overreach to call personal possession or sharing within a closed circle distribution in the REO sense.
And the kidnapping allegation involving Capricorn Clark, that was heavily disputed too, wasn't it?
Very heavily. The defense focused hard on undermining the credibility of that specific claim. Agnifilo noted Capricorn herself had said she had the biggest crush on Combs and maybe misused what she described as their dope chemistry.
Okay.
He questioned why, if she'd been kidnapped, she would have wanted to work for him again later. He cited the fact she apparently went home daily during the alleged period of confinement. Agnifilo also brought up issues with a lie detector test she took and the alleged absence of a firearm during the incident. He claimed Kid Cudi, who was apparently present, didn't tell the police about a firearm, all aimed at discrediting her account through inconsistencies and lack of corroborating evidence, especially regarding the force element needed for kidnapping.
And then there was that Intercontinental Hotel video evidence. How did the defense try to explain that?
They offered a very different interpretation. They claimed the video actually showed Cassie telling Combs to go back to the effing room. And then, crucially, they pointed to texts allegedly sent 5 days later. Combs texts, "I'm sorry." She replies, "Laugh out loud. I was just listening to sorry. They're obviously getting over it."
Implying it was all smoothed over.
That was the suggestion, that this exchange indicated a reconciliation, maybe even a playful interaction afterwards, not a kidnapping or SA. They tried to portray the entire incident as more of a dramatic lover's spat rather than a serious criminal act.
Okay. What about the presence of paid escorts? How did the defense address that?
They addressed it by claiming the individuals involved, like someone referred to as the Punisher and Daniel Phillips, were paid for their time, not specifically for intercourse.
Paid for their time.
Yes. And that, in Combs' mind, this arrangement was entirely legal. Agnifilo stated, quote, "If you get paid when you didn't have SMEG, you're getting paid for your time in Sean Combs' mind. This is legal."
So drawing a fine line between payment for companionship or other services and payment specifically for sexual acts.
Exactly. Attempting to make the activities fall outside the scope of illicit trafficking laws by reframing the purpose of the payment.
And regarding the overall riot conspiracy charge.
Agnifilo stated flatly there was no evidence that anyone is a co-conspirator in a racketeering enterprise. This included countering the prosecution's claims about someone referred to as KK, whom the defense described as simply a helpful person, not a criminal partner.
Undermining the core requirement of a RICO conspiracy.
Precisely. RICO inherently requires a conspiracy, an agreement among multiple individuals to conduct the enterprise's affairs through a pattern of racketeering. So denying the existence of co-conspirators is fundamental to attacking that charge.
And firearms, that often comes up in RICO cases.
Yes, and he strongly denied their presence in relation to the specific allegations being tried. He emphasized that, according to him, Homeland Security cannot say where the firearms were found in relation to the alleged crimes, and importantly, that firearms possession or use wasn't actually charged in this indictment.
So even if firearms were found elsewhere, it wasn't tied to these charges.
That was his argument. He also added that Combs, as a high-profile celebrity, had nothing to gain by having a firearm and everything to lose, appealing to logic about the risks involved for someone in his position.
Okay. And how did Agnifilo wrap up the defense's case?
He concluded by appealing directly to the jury's courage. He suggested the government had unfairly targeted Sean Combs and then asked them directly to acquit Mr. Combs on all charges.
So a bold finish, portraying the government as overzealous, Combs as a victim of that targeting, and making a final emotional plea for acquittal.
Exactly. A dramatic end to a dramatically different narrative than the one the prosecution presented.
This trial certainly wasn't short on intense courtroom drama, was it? Including direct interventions from the presiding judge, Judge Supermanian, who is male.
No, definitely not.
These moments often really highlighted the high stakes and the palpable tension between the opposing lawyers. It underscored how carefully the judge had to manage the whole proceedings to ensure a fair trial.
Absolutely. The judge's role became particularly visible, apparently, during and immediately after the defense's closing arguments. He really had to step in to make sure the jury focused strictly on the evidence presented and the law as he instructed them, not on any improper speculation or comments from either side that could potentially taint their deliberations.
So what happened after Agnifilo
Well,
finished?
the prosecutor, Ms. Comey, raised sharp objections. She noted that Agnifilo had improperly asked the jury to ask why the prosecutors charged as they did, basically questioning their motive.
Which is generally not allowed, right?
Correct. Juries decide based on evidence, not prosecutorial motive. Ms. Comey also pointed out he'd made claims about the Intercontinental incident maybe being just a misdemeanor, which wasn't the charge, and that arson not being charged was irrelevant to the REA go-go predicate acts they were considering.
So straying outside the lines.
That was the prosecution's argument. And Judge Subramanian agreed, quite forcefully. He stated very bluntly that Agnifilo's comments were grossly improper. He told the jury directly not to speculate about the charge and, crucially, to disregard those comments.
Wow, a direct instruction to ignore parts of the defense's closing.
Yes, a clear and forceful correction designed to immediately steer the jury back to the proper legal parameters of the case and prevent any misdirection.
And wasn't there another point where the judge intervened regarding the defense's closing?
Yes. Later, the judge also specifically deemed Agnifilo's claim that Combs was targeted by the government as not proper. He instructed the jury that this claim was something not to be considered by them in their deliberations. It really underscores the judge's diligent, very active role in maintaining the integrity of the jury's focus, making sure they base their decision solely on the evidence and the law, not on emotional appeals about government targeting or speculation about charging decisions. These kinds of judicial admonishments really highlight the difficult line attorneys have to walk, especially in high-profile cases where the temptation to maybe push the boundaries during closing arguments can be pretty strong.
Absolutely. So following the defense's arguments and those interventions from the judge, Mrs. Comey got the chance to deliver a rebuttal for the prosecution. How did she counter the defense's narrative?
She came back forcefully, point by point, with renewed vigor, aiming to dismantle the defense's arguments. She opened by arguing that Combs certainly did not take no for an answer from his girlfriends and that he beat them, immediately pushing back hard against that modern love story, framing the defense had tried so hard to establish.
Right back to the core allegations of force.
Exactly. And on that contentious issue of paid intercourse, she didn't back down. She asserted that Combs flew the intercourse workers across the country to have intercourse with Cassie and Jane while he masturbated, directly refuting the defense's claim that they were only paid for their time.
Did she offer proof for that specific claim?
She cited specific examples from testimony, referencing Daniel Phillip, who apparently testified he got paid for intercourse, and the Punisher, who allegedly received thousands with intercourse, but only 500 without, emphasizing that the money was, in the prosecution's view, directly tied to the alleged sexual acts, not just companionship or time spent.
Okay. She also offered a clarification on the legal definition of an enterprise, didn't she? To counter the defense's focus on Combs' legitimate businesses.
Yes, that was a critical legal point for the OCO charge. While the defense highlighted his successful businesses, the prosecution reiterated that an enterprise under the law can have unlawful and lawful purposes.
Meaning the legitimate side doesn't negate the alleged criminal side.
Correct. It allows the prosecution to argue that criminal activities were intertwined with the seemingly legitimate business structure. The existence of successful legal ventures doesn't automatically disprove the existence of an alleged illegal enterprise operating alongside or within it.
Got it. What about the kidnapping claim involving Capricorn Clark? Did the prosecution reaffirm that?
They did, firmly. They maintained the claim was corroborated by Kid Cudi, who, according to them, stated Capricorn Clark was forced to go along with them. Mrs. Comey also argued that the London hotel incident where Cassie was allegedly stomped on and wasn't allowed to go home to her mom constituted kidnapping, re-emphasizing the alleged use of force and control over a person's movement as meeting the legal definition.
And the arson and bribery allegations?
The prosecution insisted. Combs said he would do it, and he did, concerning the alleged arson. And they claimed Eddie Garcia's testimony showed bribery, because Garcia apparently testified he believed he could not go to the police under the agreement they had, and that Combs allegedly told him, "Watch out how you spend it," implying hush money for the arson, suggesting a clear pattern of alleged illicit financial dealings and attempts to cover up criminal acts.
What about KK, the associate the defense called just a helpful person? How did the prosecution characterize KK's role?
They pushed back hard on that characterization. Mrs. Comey argued that KK knew the Wild King Knights involved escorts and apparently read all of Combs' texts. The prosecution implied that KK's knowledge alone, coupled with alleged facilitation of these activities, made Combs himself guilty of count one, the main racketeering conspiracy charge.
So linking the alleged enabler directly to the ICO enterprise.
Exactly, reinforcing their argument that it was a concerted effort involving multiple people, not just one individual acting alone.
And the illegal substance distribution point, how did they counter the personal use defense?
They asserted that giving illegal substances to Cassie and Jane is distribution, even if the initial acquisition was for personal use, directly challenging the defense's narrower interpretation of what constitutes distribution, especially within the context of a criminal enterprise facilitating other crimes.
So sharing is distributing in this context.
That was the prosecution's argument, yes, suggesting that facilitating illegal substance use for others, particularly if it's part of controlling or coercing them, could fulfill the criteria for a predicate act under ICO.
But perhaps the most powerful part of the rebuttal, it sounds like, focused back on consent and coercion.
It really seemed to be the emotional core of the rebuttal. Ms. Comey directly challenged the defense's theory that the women involved simply wanted it. She stated unequivocally that Mia, Cassie, and Jane all said no at various points. She then rhetorically questioned the defense's money motive argument. Why would Cassie, having already settled her civil case for millions, risk perjury in a federal trial if she were lying? Why would Mia, who also settled, or Jane, who isn't suing Combs at all, put on a show for the jury?
Attacking the credibility of the defense's main counter-narrative.
Precisely, suggesting their testimonies were rooted in truth and trauma, not financial gain or some kind of act.
And she elaborated on the nature of consent itself.
Yes, very powerfully. The prosecution argued compellingly that the women's documented struggles to break free from the alleged manipulation tells you that these women told the truth. They emphasized that violence and the intercourse were often inseparable in these situations and that consent is fundamentally invalid if it's obtained through fear, manipulation, power imbalance, or incapacitation, which is illegal substances or alcohol.
That's a profound statement on consent.
It really is. It moves beyond a simplistic view of just yes or no and looks at the entire context of power and coercion. Ms. Comey cited harrowing examples mentioned in testimony, like Cassie allegedly overdosing and still having a freak-off, or Jane performing oral intercourse on someone named Anton after Combs beat her. The prosecution argued these were not consensual acts, but clear acts of trafficking, demonstrating how alleged coercion could completely override any appearance of consent.
Wow. How did the prosecution conclude their rebuttal?
They ended with a powerful statement regarding Combs' alleged sense of impunity, stating he was untouchable and did not think that these women would speak, nor that others like Kid Cudi and Deontay Nash and other men would back them up, asserting finally that the defendant is not God, he stands equal before the law.
A strong final appeal to justice.
Absolutely. A final, impactful appeal to the jury's sense of fairness and the principle of equality under the law, aiming to impress upon them that no one, regardless of their fame or power, should be above legal accountability.
Now, beyond all the intense legal arguments and the specific language used inside the courtroom, this trial really played out in a very, very public arena, didn't it? It became a significant cultural focal point.
Oh, massively so.
The online world in particular just seemed to erupt with fervent discussion. It created this whole parallel narrative, often even more volatile than the one unfolding in court.
Yeah, if you connect this to the bigger picture, the trial truly became a kind of cultural litmus test online, as the source material put it.
A litmus test? How so?
Well, the public debate was incredibly fiery. Conversations were often framing the situation in really binary terms. Either this was a righteous pursuit of justice for victims, or it was a cynical public takedown of a high-profile, successful figure.
So very polarized.
Extremely polarized. You saw significant engagement, passionate arguments erupting on all sides. The online discourse, as noted, explicitly asked, is this about justice or public takedown? That question itself really highlights the division and the intense public interest that just transcended the courtroom walls. People weren't just passively following the legal proceedings. They were actively dissecting and debating the broader societal implications. What does it mean when such grave allegations are leveled against a powerful public figure? People drew parallels to other high-profile cases involving celebrity accountability. We saw very strong voices emerge, some fiercely advocating for the alleged victims, others just as fiercely defending Combs, questioning the motives, the timing, everything.
And this public spectacle wasn't just confined to screens, to the online realm. There was that particularly striking, almost bizarre moment that happened during a lunch break right outside the courthouse itself.
Yes, that was quite something. It brought the drama into the immediate physical space in a truly surreal way. A man, apparently completely unrelated to the case, just began suddenly convulsing and collapsed near the courthouse entrance,
Creating a medical emergency right there.
right in front of everyone.
Yeah.
And what made it particularly surreal, according to the report, was the jarring juxtaposition. Cohn's sons, Justin, Quincy, and Christian, happened to be exiting the courthouse right during this commotion.
Oh, wow.
They reportedly looked briefly at the distressed man lying there and then quickly got into a waiting black van amidst all the chaos. The source described a confusing split scene that ensued, with this mob of spectators shoving phone cameras up towards the Combs family vehicle while the stricken man lay just a few feet away.
That's an incredible image, almost cinematic in its absurdity.
It really is, isn't it? It speaks volumes about the intense, maybe overwhelming level of public and media attention, where the lines between serious news, personal tragedy, and pure entertainment can become incredibly blurred. Apparently, the man later regained consciousness and was taken away in an ambulance, but that image, that moment of stark contrast, it certainly resonated and circulated widely.
And this public engagement, it wasn't just about the events or the people involved, but also about how people perceived the legal teams themselves, right?
Yes, the sources indicate that the public was definitely weighing in on the lawyer's performance too, with some in the broader discussion expressing opinions like, the defense really dropped the ball.
Interesting. How significant is that kind of public assessment of legal strategy, even though it's outside the jury's deliberation? Does it shape the overall narrative of a trial like this?
I think it's incredibly significant, even if it has zero direct bearing on the actual legal outcome decided by the jury. Public opinion about legal performance can absolutely shape future cases, it can influence public trust in the justice system as a whole, and it certainly impacts the reputations of the attorneys involved, for better or worse. In these high-profile trials, suddenly everyone with an internet connection becomes a legal pundit, right? Dissecting every cross-examination, every strategic choice. When you see comments like the defense dropped the ball, it often reflects a public feeling that maybe key points weren't effectively countered by the defense, or perhaps that the prosecution's emotional appeals weren't met with strong enough factual rebuttals in the public's eye. It just adds another complex layer to the trial's broad impact, extending its reach far beyond the courtroom and deep into the realm of public perception, where narratives can solidify and take hold, sometimes regardless of what the actual verdict turns out to be.
That makes sense. Okay, so as those intense closing arguments finally wrapped up, the focus shifted entirely, completely onto the jury.
The crucial moment.
The judge made that key decision about when they would receive their final instructions and, critically, when they would begin their deliberations. It really is the moment where everything comes down to those 12 individuals chosen to weigh all that evidence and render a verdict.
That's absolutely right. What happens now is entirely in the hands of that jury. They've received extensive instructions on the applicable law from Judge Subramanian. Those instructions guide them on how to interpret the mountain of evidence they've heard over weeks and weeks of testimony. Their deliberations, well, they're the culmination of this entire complex, often emotional process. They have to sit down together and decide whether the prosecution has proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt, that's the standard, or if the defense's arguments, the counter-narrative, have created enough reasonable doubt to warrant an acquittal.
And the judge decided they wouldn't start right away on Friday?
Correct. Judge Subramanian decided to charge the jury, meaning give them their final instructions, on Monday morning. He stated it would simply be too late otherwise to start effectively on Friday afternoon.
Makes sense. Give them a fresh start.
Exactly. It was a practical decision, ensuring the jury could begin their absolutely crucial work with fresh minds, full attention, rather than starting late on a Friday and having their momentum broken by the weekend. So, the jury will begin their deliberations on Monday. It's a monumental, often painstaking task after such a high-profile and emotionally charged trial. They'll have to meticulously review the evidence, the arguments, the legal definitions before they can reach a unanimous decision.
And once those deliberations begin, the possible outcomes are, of course, pretty clear-cut legally, even if getting there is complex.
Right. The jury will weigh all the evidence presented. Everything from the prosecution's arguments for that Errico conviction based on the alleged dozens of predicate acts and the whole criminal enterprise narrative to the defense's counter-arguments that frame the relationships as consensual or perhaps financially motivated or simply outside the scope of racketeering altogether.
So the primary outcomes.
Yes, the primary possible outcomes are either a conviction on some or all of the counts, which would indicate the jury found the prosecution met its very high burden of proof, or an acquittal on some or all counts, meaning they found the prosecution did not meet that burden.
Right.
But, no matter what the verdict turns out to be, this trial forces us, all of us, to confront some really challenging questions, doesn't it? About power dynamics, about accountability, about the very nature of consent, especially in the context of celebrity and immense influence.
Definitely leaves a lot to think about.
It really does. What happens if Combs walks free? What are the implications? What happens if he doesn't? Is this a moment of justice that potentially sets a new precedent for holding powerful public figures accountable in these kinds of cases? Or is it primarily, maybe cynically, just a massive media moment, one that simply highlights our enduring, maybe unsettling fascination with the private lives of public figures, regardless of the legal outcome? How do we, as a society, process such intense, often contradictory narratives? How do we draw our own conclusions in a world that's just saturated with information, misinformation, and competing viewpoints? This case certainly provides ample material for all of us to continue mulling over long after the verdict is finally delivered.
Indeed it does. You've been listening to Buzzing Media Trending Talks. No shouting, no rumors, just what's actually happening. Subscribe and stay tuned as the verdict approaches.